The ocean was silent before the storm. From the decks of the American fleet, the horizon looked endless. Blue water stretching to eternity, calm, deceptive, hiding something monstrous beneath. The soldiers stood at the rails, clutching helmets, cigarettes trembling between callous fingers, each man pretending not to be afraid. They had heard whispers. The Japanese were waiting for them. Not retreating, not surrendering, waiting. The target was small, just another dot in the Pacific, another name they'd never heard before the war. Tarawa. Barely 8 square kilometers of coral and jungle, but fortified like a floating fortress. The Japanese had built bunkers of steel and concrete, trenches that cut into the sand like veins, and machine gun nests hidden in coconut logs. For months they had prepared for this. For the Americans, it was supposed to be a quick strike, a warm-up. 3 days, the planners said, take the island, move on. But war laughs at schedules. At dawn on November 20, 1943, the sea exploded. From 23 miles offshore, battleships and cruisers opened fire. The sky became smoke and thunder. The Americans believed no one could survive such bombardment. Shells ripped through palm trees, sand flew like glass, and the island disappeared beneath waves of fire. It was like watching a piece of the earth die. Officers nodded in satisfaction. Nothing could live through that, one said. But deep inside the bunkers, the Japanese crouched in silence, their faces streaked with sweat and sand, their ears ringing. They waited. They knew this moment was coming, and when the shelling stopped, they emerged like ghosts, unbroken, ready. The first wave of U.S. Marines hit the reef, and disaster struck. The tides had failed them. The water was too shallow for landing craft, too deep for the men to wade easily. Boats got stuck on coral. Soldiers jumped into chest-deep water, rifles held high, packs weighing them down. Machine guns opened up from the shore, cutting through the surf like knives through fabric. Men fell face first into the ocean. Blood mingled with salt water. The sea turned pink. From pillboxes and trenches, the Japanese fired relentlessly, methodically, their discipline terrifying in its precision. They had sworn not to surrender, not to retreat, only to die with honor. To them, the island was sacred ground. Every palm tree, every grain of sand was to be defended until death. American Marines crawled forward inch by inch, hiding behind corpses, crates, and burning wreckage. The air reeked of smoke, cordite, and blood. Radios screamed. Officers shouted orders no one could hear over the gunfire. "Keep moving," they yelled. But every step forward was a gamble with fate. On that beach, Red Beach 1, the war took a new shape. The Americans realized they were no longer fighting a conventional enemy. They were fighting a belief. The Bushido Code, the ancient warrior's creed, pulsed in every Japanese heart. It was not just a military doctrine. It was faith. Surrender was shame. Death was duty. Victory or annihilation, there was no middle ground. As the day dragged on, the Marines pushed inland inch by inch. Flamethrowers hissed like angry serpents, clearing bunkers one by one. Each Japanese soldier fought to the last breath. Some pulled grenades to their chest when cornered. Others charged into gunfire with bayonets raised, shouting ancient cries of honor. One officer, wounded and bleeding, refused medical help, crawling back into his post to die where he had stood. When night fell, the island burned like a wound on the ocean. That night, a Marine named Corporal Ellis wrote in his notebook under a flickering flashlight, "They said it would take 3 days. It took 3 minutes to understand it was hell." He would not survive to see the end of the battle. The next morning, more Marines landed. The beaches were littered with bodies. The tide carried the dead back and forth as if the ocean itself refused to let them go. American tanks tried to move forward but sank in the soft coral. Engineers cleared mines with their hands. And always, the Japanese waited, hidden, patient, merciless. They had prepared for every inch of ground. Every bunker was connected by tunnels. Destroy one, and soldiers would appear from behind you. It was like fighting ghosts in daylight. In Tokyo, the High Command had given the garrison one order: hold Tarawa at all costs. They obeyed without hesitation. Their commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, told his men, It will take 1 million men 100 years to take this island. It would take 76 hours, but the price would be beyond imagination. By the second day, the Americans began to break through the western defenses. Grenades exploded in the trenches. The smell of burning flesh and oil hung over the island like a curse. The Japanese refused to retreat. Even when wounded, they crawled toward the sound of battle. For them, this was not war, it was sacrifice. Each man believed his death would honor his emperor, his ancestors, his family. They fought with the calm of men who had already accepted death. On the third night, Admiral Shibazaki was killed when a shell struck his command post. The remaining soldiers did not falter. They fought on without orders, without hope. They became what the Americans would later call the perfect defenders, men who could not be broken because they did not seek to live. When the final assault came, the Americans advanced through ruins. Every bunker was a tomb, every trench a grave. The surviving Japanese gathered for one last Banzai charge, a desperate rush into machine gun fire, bayonets flashing, voices raised in one final cry to the gods. None made it far. When the smoke cleared, the battle for Tarawa was over. Out of nearly 4,800 Japanese defenders, only 17 survived. The rest lay silent, unburied, scattered across the island. The Americans lost over 1,000 men in 3 days. It was victory, but it did not feel like one. A Marine chaplain walked through the wreckage afterwards, whispering prayers over bodies of friend and foe alike. He later wrote, "I looked into their faces, and I could not tell who was enemy or ally anymore. Only sons of mothers." The news stunned the United States. Photographs of the battle appeared in magazines, images of bodies on beaches, men crouching behind burning tanks, faces empty from exhaustion. For the first time, Americans saw what island hopping really meant. Victory in the Pacific would not come easily. It would come in blood, inch by inch, island by island, against an enemy that refused to die before it was dead. But for Japan, Tarawa became a grim legend. The Imperial military broadcast the story as proof of Japanese courage, proof that even surrounded and outgunned, their soldiers had fought like gods. The government praised their heroic deaths. Yet beneath the triumphal speeches, something darker stirred. They had lost an entire garrison for one small island, and there were thousands more islands between them and Japan. The truth was clear, even if unspoken. They could not win, but they would not stop. The Japanese high command began to fortify the next islands, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each one a fortress, each one to be defended until the last man. Soldiers were told, "You are the shield of the homeland." Civilians were told, "Death is better than surrender." Even children began to learn to die with honor rather than live in shame. The code that once shaped samurai duels was now consuming an empire. Back on Tarawa, the surviving Marines raised the flag over the ruins. It fluttered weakly in the smoke. A photographer captured the moment. Not triumph, but exhaustion. The men stared at the horizon, realizing that this was only the beginning. Ahead lay more islands, more blood, more death. Tarawa had shown them what the Pacific War truly was. Not a campaign of conquest, but a slow, grinding descent into madness, fought against men who believed that life was a lesser thing than duty. In the months that followed, survivors carried that memory with them. The sound of waves crashing over coral became a nightmare. The smell of burning coconut oil haunted their sleep. They would speak of it in whispers. Tarawa was hell. But in Tokyo, military leaders studied the same battle and came to a different conclusion. If a handful of men could bleed the Americans this much, then total resistance could make invasion impossible. From that moment, Japan's war strategy changed. No more withdrawals, no more retreats. Every island, every mountain, every cave would be turned into a graveyard for the invaders. The Pacific, once filled with sunlight and song, would become a place of shadows and screams. Both sides would pay in blood, but one side, bound by an ancient code, would make death itself a weapon. Tarawa was not just the first island that refused to fall easily. It was the first island that taught both sides
a terrible truth, that courage and madness can look the same when men are asked to die for something they cannot surrender.
By 1945, the Pacific was a cemetery. From island to island, the Americans had clawed their way west. Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, each one costing thousands of lives. And now they stood before Okinawa, the last step before the Japanese homeland. Whoever controlled this island would hold the key to victory or annihilation. Okinawa was not just another battlefield. It was home to over 400,000 civilians, farmers, fishermen, families who had tilled its red soil for generations. The Japanese military knew this. They turned villages into fortresses, schools into bunkers, and caves into tombs. The Imperial Army told the civilians the same lie they had told soldiers for years. The Americans will kill you all, dishonor your women, and burn your land. So when the U.S. invasion fleet appeared on the horizon, more than 1,500 ships, the largest amphibious force in human history, the people of Okinawa dug into the earth and waited for the end of the world. The sky over the island filled with black smoke as warships pounded the shore. The roar was constant, a thunder that swallowed thought. For 7 days, the bombardment never stopped. Then, on April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, the Americans landed. At first, there was silence. No gunfire, no resistance. The Marines moved cautiously, expecting ambushes at every turn. But the Japanese were not on the beaches. They were waiting inland, in tunnels, caves, and mountains, under the command of General Mitsuru Ujishima, a man of strict honor and tragic conviction. Ujishima's plan was brutal and brilliant. Let the Americans land, stretch their lines, and then bleed them dry. Every inch of Okinawa would become a trap. The goal was not victory, it was delay. Delay until Japan could prepare its final defense at home. Delay until the invaders lost their will. When the Americans reached the ridges, they met the first wall of fire. Artillery screamed from hidden emplacements. Mortar shells fell like rain. Machine guns chattered from caves where no human light had touched in years. Every rock seemed to shoot back. The soldiers called it the Shuri Line, a labyrinth of bunkers and tunnels stretching across the island's spine. It was not a battlefront, it was a maze of death. Advancing even a few yards cost dozens of lives. The mud sucked at boots, filled with rain and blood. The air stank of gunpowder and decay. Soldiers slept standing up in foxholes because to lie down meant drowning in water or shrapnel. Corpses lay half buried in the muck, eyes open to the endless sky. A young Marine wrote in his journal, "Hell isn't below us, it's here, under our feet." From the cliffs, Japanese artillerymen watched with steady hands. Their orders were absolute, hold until death. Many wrote farewell letters before the battle began, sealing them in small boxes to be found after the war. "I will die smiling, for my life is given for the Emperor," one wrote to his mother. Another wrote, "If you hear of my death, please do not weep. Be proud, I did not surrender." Inside their caves, they lived like ghosts, sleeping beside ammunition, whispering prayers before loading another round. Food was scarce, medicine was gone, wounds festered, yet discipline never wavered. Even as the Americans closed in, the defenders kept fighting, their resolve turning from courage into something darker, obsession. Above them, the skies burned. Kamikaze pilots, divine wind, began their final missions. Young men, some barely 18, strapped into planes with just enough fuel for one flight. They carried letters in their pockets, poems in their hearts, and death on their wings. One pilot wrote before takeoff, "I wish I had been born 1,000 times, so I could die for my country 1,000 times more." They came in waves, hundreds at a time, diving straight into warships. The ocean turned into a funeral pyre, flames and steel, oil slicks spreading like blood veins. Over 5,000 American sailors died during the Okinawa campaign, many from kamikaze strikes. On board, survivors watched the skies and whispered, "The whole nation's gone mad." On the ground, madness spread in another form. Civilians, caught between the two armies, were trapped in terror. Many fled into caves, only to find Japanese soldiers already there. Some soldiers, indoctrinated to believe that capture meant dishonor, ordered families to commit suicide rather than fall into enemy hands. Mothers pressed grenades to their chests. Children jumped from cliffs, holding hands. American soldiers found bodies scattered along the coastlines, whole families, faces serene in death, victims not of bombs, but of fear. As the battle dragged into May, the rains came. Typhoon season. The heavens themselves seemed to mourn. Mud flowed like rivers, weapons jammed. Men fought hand to hand in the sludge, slipping, stabbing, choking on the earth itself. The stench became unbearable, rot, sweat, smoke, and sorrow. Marines began calling Okinawa the meat grinder. Even the generals knew the end was near. General Ujishima's aides begged him to surrender, to save what was left of his men. But he refused. To him, surrender was betrayal. Instead, he gathered his officers one final time beneath the night sky. They drank sake, bowed deeply to each other, and recited poems from the samurai. Then, as dawn broke, Ujishima and his chief of staff walked to a quiet ridge overlooking the battlefield. They knelt, drew their swords, and performed seppuku, ritual suicide. Their bodies were found later, heads bowed toward the sea. When the firing finally stopped in late June, the island was unrecognizable, hills flattened, forests gone, villages erased. Out of 100,000 Japanese soldiers, fewer than 8,000 survived. Nearly 150,000 civilians were dead, one-third of Okinawa's entire population. The Americans had won, but at a cost that left victory hollow. Over 12,500 Americans lay dead or missing, with tens of thousands wounded. One general, walking through the wreckage, whispered, "If this is what it takes to take one island, how can we ever invade Japan?" That question haunted everyone. Okinawa was supposed to be the last step before invading the mainland, but now planners stared at casualty estimates that reached into the millions. They had seen what fight to the last man truly meant. They had seen children trained with bamboo spears, civilians convinced to die, pilots turning themselves into weapons. And they knew, if Japan's army and people fought on their home soil the way they had on Okinawa, the cost would be unimaginable. Historians would later call Okinawa the battle that ended the war. Not because it was the final fight, but because it forced a choice. The atomic bomb was not born only in laboratories, it was born in the mud of Okinawa, in the horror that no one wanted to repeat. For Japan, Okinawa became the last stand of the old world, a world ruled by the Bushido spirit, by loyalty beyond reason. In its ashes, the empire's illusions burned away. Soldiers who survived were broken, haunted by what they'd seen, not only the deaths of enemies, but of their own people. One officer later wrote in his diary, "We fought like lions, but we were trapped by our own honor. We forgot that to die is easy, to live with defeat is harder." After the war, Okinawa's survivors carried scars that never faded. The land itself seemed to remember, bones unearthed with every rainfall, caves still echoing with voices of the past. For decades, locals refused to speak of it, too painful, too sacred. But in their silence, the truth remained. The fanatic resistance that once defined Japan had consumed everything, even the innocent. In Tokyo, decades later, a monument was built on a quiet hill. It bore a simple inscription, "To those who fell, on all sides." Beneath it rested the names of soldiers, sailors, civilians, Americans, Japanese, all equal in death. Visitors often say the air feels heavy, as if the souls of the lost still linger, watching, whispering. Perhaps they are not angry, perhaps they are only tired. Okinawa was the war's final lesson, that courage without mercy becomes cruelty, that loyalty without wisdom becomes ruin. The Japanese fought with unmatched spirit, but spirit alone could not shield them from truth. War devours the very values it claims to defend. When peace finally came, Japan rebuilt not from victory but from ashes. Yet the same discipline that once forged kamikazes became the foundation of rebirth. The Bushido spirit survived, not in suicide charges or battle cries, but in patience, precision, and pride in one's craft. The same fire that once burned for destruction now fueled creation, in factories, in classrooms, in art. But the ghosts of Okinawa still whisper a warning. They remind the world that even the purest ideals, when twisted by fear and pride, can lead to tragedy beyond imagination.
They remind us that honor must be guided by humanity, or it will consume both. And somewhere, on a quiet night, when the wind passes through the caves of Okinawa, one might still hear echoes, faint cries carried by the sea, not of hatred, but of longing, for peace, for forgiveness, for remembrance.
By 1944, the Pacific was no longer a chain of distant battles. It had become a graveyard stretching across the ocean. Every island that fell seemed to demand a higher price in blood than the one before it. The Japanese soldiers who still held the islands knew it. The Americans who advanced toward them knew it too. Each side understood that something greater than geography was at stake now. Japan's empire was collapsing, but its soldiers were determined to make that collapse cost as much as possible. The Pacific was shrinking. Once, Japan's dominion stretched like an iron ring across Asia. Now, it was a broken chain. American forces were closing in from every direction, and the islands that had once been outposts of conquest were now tombs of defense. For the Japanese, there was no retreat. The emperor's orders were clear. Every soldier was to fight to the death. No surrender, no mercy, no escape. The battlefield had become sacred ground, and death was their offering. The Americans knew what awaited them. They had seen it at Tarawa, at Saipan, at Peleliu. They had learned that every cave could hide a sniper, every ridge could conceal a machine gun nest, every corpse could hold a grenade. The Japanese defense was not merely tactical, it was spiritual. They fought with a conviction that defied logic. Even when ammunition ran out, they charged with bayonets, with knives, with their bare hands. They did not fight to win. They fought to die well. When the U.S. Marines landed on Iwo Jima in February 1945, they expected a short battle. The island was small, only 8 square miles, but its strategic value was immense. From Iwo Jima, America was the empire's last defenses. Yet beneath that small island lay something unseen, a fortress carved into the earth. Japanese General Tadamachi Kurabayashi had turned the island into a labyrinth of tunnels, bunkers, and hidden artillery. For months, his men had lived underground preparing for the apocalypse. When the bombardment began, the Americans unleashed the heaviest naval artillery barrage of the war. The island shook under 6,800 tons of shells. The Marines believed nothing could have survived. But when they stormed the beaches, the silence was eerie, and then the island exploded. Machine guns opened from the cliffs, mortars rained down, and snipers began their grim work. The Japanese had waited, letting the enemy come closer, letting them believe they were safe. The sand turned red, the air thick with smoke and screams. Kurabayashi's strategy was not to repel the invaders. He knew that was impossible. His goal was to bleed them, to make every inch of ground a monument to resistance. He forbade Banzai charges, knowing they wasted lives. Instead, his men fought from the shadows, emerging, striking, then vanishing again into the tunnels. It was a slow, merciless battle of endurance. The Americans had overwhelming firepower, but the Japanese had something harder to kill: conviction. For 36 days, Iwo Jima became hell on earth. When the smoke finally cleared, 21,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. Only a few hundred had been captured alive. They had fought to the last, refusing food, water, or medical care. The Americans had taken the island, but at the cost of nearly 7,000 dead and 20,000 wounded. For every patch of black sand, for every flag raised, blood had been paid in equal measure. When the U.S. flag was lifted over Mount Suribachi, it was not just victory, it was survival. But even as Iwo Jima fell, Okinawa waited, the largest and bloodiest battle of the Pacific. Okinawa was not just another island, it was Japan's last line of defense, the gateway to the homeland. If Okinawa fell, there would be nothing left between the Allies and Tokyo itself. The Japanese army, the navy, and even civilians were mobilized for what would become the most desperate stand of the war. When American ships approached Okinawa in April 1945, the sea itself seemed to ignite. Waves of kamikaze pilots hurled themselves at the fleet, turning their planes into living bombs. The sky was filled with fire and falling metal. Some planes missed, plunging into the waves like flaming comets.
Others struck their targets, erupting in explosions that shook the decks and filled the air with screams. Over the course of the battle, nearly 2,000 kamikaze attacks would strike, the most intense suicide assault in history. On the ground, Okinawa became a slaughterhouse. The Japanese army dug into caves, tunnels, and fortified ridges. Civilians were trapped between the lines, farmers, families, children. The Americans advanced slowly, inch by inch, under relentless rain and fire. The mud was so deep that tanks sunk. The air reeked of rot and cordite. Every hill was a fortress, every valley a grave. Japanese soldiers, starving and wounded, fought on till the very end. They used their last grenades to kill themselves, sometimes clutching the enemy as they fell. But the most haunting tragedy of Okinawa was not the soldiers, it was the civilians. Thousands of Okinawans, deceived by propaganda, believed that the Americans would torture or kill them. They were told by their own leaders that death was preferable to capture. Mothers held their children and leapt from cliffs. Entire families walked into the sea. Others were forced to fight, handed bamboo spears, sent into hopeless battles. The island's beauty became its curse. Its cliffs, its caves, its beaches, all stained with blood. By the time the guns fell silent, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and as many civilians were dead. The Americans lost 12,000 men. It was the last and most brutal test of the Japanese defense, and it proved one thing. If the Allies invaded the Japanese mainland, the death toll would be beyond comprehension. Every man, woman, and child was prepared to die for the emperor. The fanaticism that had turned each island into a graveyard was now poised to consume the homeland itself. In Tokyo, the government was fractured. Some generals wanted to continue fighting, to arm civilians, to drag the entire nation into one final act of collective suicide. Others knew it was madness. The emperor himself, silent throughout most of the war, finally spoke. His words would decide the fate of millions. But even as he sought peace, the Japanese defenders refused to yield. They believed surrender would dishonor themselves, but also their ancestors. And so the dying continued. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the sky itself seemed to collapse. The world had never seen such horror. Cities erased in seconds, shadows burned into walls, tens of thousands vaporized. The scale of destruction was beyond imagination. Yet even then, parts of the Japanese military refused to accept defeat. Some officers plotted coups, trying to kidnap the emperor to prevent surrender. They saw the bomb not as a sign of defeat, but as another trial to be endured with honor. But the emperor's voice, broadcast over the radio, broke the silence. He said, "We must endure the unendurable." For the first time, the people of Japan heard their divine ruler speak as a man, not a god. His words carried sorrow, humility, and an acceptance that the code of death could no longer serve life. The Bushido that once glorified sacrifice would now have to bow to survival. When the war finally ended, the Japanese soldiers who had once sworn to die in defense of the emperor emerged from bunkers and caves. Some wept, others stared blankly at the horizon. They had given everything, their comrades, their homes, their faith, and still it had not been enough. Some refused to believe the war was over. Others simply could not imagine life without battle. The Americans who walked those battlefields saw the cost of fanatic resistance up close. The piles of bodies, the shattered helmets, the charred remains of men who had chosen death over surrender. They saw the faces of civilians who had been caught between two unrelenting forces. They saw the children who had survived, their eyes hollow, their innocence gone. And in that silence, they understood something profound. Victory had come, but it did not feel like triumph. It felt like tragedy. For Japan, defeat was not the end. It was the beginning of transformation. The same discipline that had turned its people into warriors would now turn them into builders. The same spirit that had fueled destruction would now fuel creation. The fanatic resistance that had turned each island into a graveyard would in time give birth to a nation determined never to repeat its past. The Pacific Islands, once soaked in blood, slowly began to heal. The jungles grew back. The waves washed over the wreckage. The bones of the dead, both Japanese and American, rested side by side under the same sun. Nature did what humans could not. It forgave.
But for those who survived, the memories never faded. The smell of smoke, the cries of the dying, the sound of the waves breaking against the shore where so many had fallen. These echoes lingered. And even now, when the wind moves through the palms on Saipan, when the surf crashes against Iwo Jima's black sand, it feels as if the island itself remembers. In the end, Japan's bloody defense was not just a story of war, it was a story of belief, of how conviction can elevate a nation to greatness, but also drag it into darkness. It is a story of men who fought for honor, even when that honor destroyed them. And it is a warning that when a people are taught that death is nobler than life, they will build a world where even victory tastes like ash.
The Pacific finally fell silent, but the silence did not feel like peace, it felt like exhaustion. The stillness that comes when the world has bled itself dry. The jungles were no longer alive with gunfire, yet the air still smelled of gunpowder, rot, and smoke. Islands, once carved with trenches, now held shallow graves. The ocean, which had witnessed so much fire and fury, glimmered with an almost cruel calm, as if pretending it had not swallowed so many dreams. Japan's empire, once burning with ambition and pride, lay in ruins. But within those ruins lived a spirit that refused to die, the echo of men who had believed that death in defense of their homeland was the only honorable fate left. Across the Pacific, the survivors emerged like ghosts stepping out of fog. On small islands, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, soldiers crawled from caves after weeks of silence, their uniforms torn, their eyes sunken, their minds trapped between reality and delusion. Many refused to believe the war was over. To them, surrender was not possible. To surrender meant disgrace. They had been told that death was preferable, that surrender was the ultimate betrayal. So they hid, waiting for orders that would never come, holding to an oath that no longer existed. Some continued to fight for months, even years. Others took their own lives rather than live in what they saw as dishonor. The war had ended for the world, but for them, it never truly stopped. Japan itself lay in ruin. Cities once vibrant with life and laughter were now ashes. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had become graveyards of shadows, their destruction beyond imagination. The Japanese people, civilians who had endured bombings, hunger, and loss, faced a new kind of survival. They had been told they were divine, that their emperor was the living embodiment of heaven. But now the emperor spoke on the radio, his voice trembling as he uttered words no one believed they would ever hear. Surrender. It was not just a political defeat. It was the death of a worldview, the shattering of a centuries-old belief in honor above life itself. In the days after the surrender, Allied troops stepped onto Japanese soil expecting fierce resistance. Instead, they found order, humility, and quiet devastation. Streets lined with civilians bowing, children standing silently beside mothers who wept without tears. There was no rebellion, no ambush, only surrender carried out with the same discipline that once fueled war. Japan's warrior spirit had not vanished, it had transformed, reshaped by necessity, bent but not broken. The code that once glorified death would now have to serve life. In the ruins of the Imperial Army's command, officers burned documents, records, and maps. They wept as they did so, not from guilt, but from the weight of failure. Failure to protect their emperor, their country, their ideals. To them, it was not just defeat, it was shame so deep it reached beyond the grave. Some generals, unwilling to live with that shame, chose ritual suicide, seppuku, as their final act of loyalty. Their blood became their last salute. The code of Bushido, twisted by propaganda, had consumed its own creators. But outside the devastated command posts, life was stirring again. Farmers returned to broken fields. Mothers rebuilt homes from rubble. Children scavenged for food and smiled when they found a single grain of rice. The resilience of the Japanese people, the same endurance that had once fueled their military fanaticism, now became a force for recovery. The nation would rise again, not through conquest, but through reconstruction. The same discipline that once built war machines now built schools, industries, and dreams. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers, expected hatred, rebellion, maybe even assassination attempts. What he encountered instead was cooperation, a quiet, determined people ready to begin again. He watched the culture that had once sworn to fight to the last man now turn its spirit toward peace with the same relentless focus. Japan disarmed, restructured its government, rewrote its constitution. The sword was sheathed, but the spirit behind it remained alive, redefined. And yet, in the shadows of those rebuilding years, there were ghosts, unseen, but deeply felt. Every village, every island, every coastline whispered stories of sons who never returned. In Okinawa alone, over 100,000 civilians died. Farmers, mothers, children, caught between enemy firepower and Japanese fanaticism. Many had been told to kill themselves rather than fall into enemy hands. They had been deceived by propaganda so powerful that even the will to live was labeled dishonorable. Decades later, Japan would confront that truth, slowly, painfully in textbooks, museums, and memorials. The courage of those who fought was not denied, but the cruelty of their indoctrination could not be ignored. For the soldiers who survived, the war never truly ended. Some wandered for years, unable to return home, haunted by what they had seen and done. A few, like Hiroa Onoda, remained hidden in the jungles for decades, convinced that surrender was impossible. When Onoda was finally found in 1974, he was still wearing his old uniform, his rifle clean, his orders memorized. For 30 years he had lived on Kokonuk and memories, fighting a war that the rest of the world had long forgotten. When he was finally told it was over, he wept, not from relief, but from realization. His war had been a lie, and his faith had been used against him. In a small ceremony, his commanding officer, brought out of retirement, formally relieved him of duty. Onoda saluted, bowed, and handed over his rifle. His face was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of 3 lost decades. He had lived by Bushido, the code of loyalty, discipline, and duty, but he had also been a prisoner of it. The same values that gave Japan its strength also chained it to tragedy. The same fire that once drove the samurai to glory had consumed millions in the name of false honor. But even in defeat, something extraordinary happened. The world expected Japan to collapse, to vanish under the guilt and ruin of war. Instead, it transformed. In less than 2 decades, Japan became a symbol of rebirth, a nation rebuilt from ashes into one of the world's most advanced societies. Its factories hummed with innovation, its cities glowed with new energy, and its people embraced peace with the same passion they once gave to war. The Bushido spirit, that relentless pursuit of excellence, discipline, and duty, survived, but it had evolved. The sword had become a tool. The warrior had become a craftsman. The battlefield replaced by the boardroom, the dojo, the classroom. In the decades that followed, Japan's new warriors were not soldiers, but thinkers, engineers, artists, and innovators. The same pride that once shaped their armies now shaped their culture, technology, and art. And yet, in quiet moments, the nation still mourned. The graves of the fallen were not forgotten. Shrines were built, flowers laid, prayers whispered. The names of the dead, millions of them, echoed through generations. The ghosts of the Pacific did not vanish. They became part of Japan's identity, a constant reminder that strength without compassion leads only to ruin. In Okinawa, the cliffs still hold the echoes of screams from families who jumped rather than surrender. In Iwo Jima, the black sand still hides the bones of men who refused to retreat. In the forests of Peleliu and Guadalcanal, rusting helmets lie beneath vines, nature reclaiming what war had stolen. And in every Japanese home that lost a father, a brother, a son, the memory lingers, not as propaganda, not as glory, but as sorrow, quiet and profound. The nation that once vowed never to surrender has learned that peace, too, requires courage. The Bushido Code, once the creed of death, has become a philosophy of life, a reminder that true honor lies not in dying for one's beliefs, but in living by them with integrity. Today, in Japan's martial arts schools, students still bow before training. They learn discipline, respect, humility. They learn that strength is not domination, but control. They learn that the sword in the hands of the wise is not a weapon, but a teacher. The warrior spirit lives on, not in battlefields, but in hearts, tempered by time, guided by reflection. And for those who walk the beaches of the Pacific today, the tourists, the historians, the descendants, the land still speaks. Beneath the waves lie steel hulks of battleships and bones of sailors. The coral reefs glow with life, feeding on the remnants of death. Nature, in its quiet wisdom, has reclaimed what humanity destroyed. The islands that were once graveyards now bloom with flowers. The jungles that hid snipers now sing with birds. The world moves on, but it does not forget. The story of Japan's bloody defense is not just a military tale. It is a human one. A story of faith, fear, devotion, and transformation. It is the story of how a nation faced its darkest moment and chose not to remain there. How it carried the weight of defeat and turned it into the fuel for rebirth. How it honored its fallen not by repeating their path, but by building a world where their sacrifice would never need to be repeated. As the sun rises over the Pacific, the waves touch the shores where men fought and died believing they would live forever in honor.